Back on the road this weekend, a relatively short trip to Watford for the lunchtime kickoff. Always enjoyed a trip to Vicarage Road. Hopefully Norwich can obviously, I suppose, maintain their momentum, positive momentum after the big win against Swansea last weekend. Adam Harvey joined by Samuel Seaman for your preview show. Of course, we want your comments, questions, score predictions, whatever it might be around anything Norwich City down in the comment section below. We'll work through those as we go through the show. Sam, we'll start with that Swansea performance. Obviously, 4 or 5 days on now, 5-1 victory at home. How do you kind of assess the picture, I suppose, as a whole at the moment? I know you've done a piece on this in terms of the playoff push during the week and whether that's something that's sort of achievable, I suppose, for this Norwich City group, given the current situation. Players returning from injury, hopefully in fairly short order over the next few weeks. Eurosec going to be in the building by the time we play that fixture at Derby next Saturday. I mean, everything feels a little bit more positive. That win kind of, I suppose, has just turned the corner and turned the page a little bit.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, and you mentioned that piece, and I am still wondering if I've been drawn into the bait a little bit of the Championship table, and I think it's natural for everyone to get excited after a win like that. I think that was what we saw with the reverse fixture against Watford, the win against Hull, that week where they beat Plymouth and Luton quite convincingly in consecutive home games, and we've seen a number of times this season that it feels like Norwich are in a position to then kick on, especially when you look at the Championship table, because to be honest, I think with the quality of the league this season, quite a lot of those teams who are even in and around the top 6 aren't really that great, and the points totals aren't amazing for those teams. So the fact that Norwich are only 5 points off the top 6 at the moment probably tells you a little bit about the quality of the league, but it also tells you that if they can put a run of wins together, then they'll be in a really good position. And I think you look at the next 9 fixtures, then it shows that there is an opportunity for Norwich to go and collect some points and maybe even push themselves into that conversation, especially when you consider, some of the things you mentioned, having Borja Sainz back available in a couple of games as well. Josh Sargent, I think, is one of those where it's one thing saying how good he is and then another thing seeing it with your own eyes. And we all saw him back to his best on Saturday. So, yeah, it was a win that, to be honest, it didn't feel like a 5-1. I think Swansea basically packed it in towards the end there. And probably in most games, Norwich don't go and get those extra couple of goals late on. But it was still obviously a majorly positive performance. It was a step in the right direction. And I think just the fact that we're even asking that question and that I'm even in a position to write that piece without being laughed out of the room tells you that things are heading in a more positive direction and that there is an opportunity for Norwich now. But if you look at a period of 9 games, I don't think it would be fair to say that Norwich have produced form over a timescale like that yet this season. So it won't be easy at all. But I think the feeling is one of optimism after a pretty emphatic win on Saturday.
Yeah, you mentioned there a certain American striker back with 2 goals last weekend against Swansea. I mean, his Championship record kind of speaks for itself. Just going to pull up the stats now. I think it's 35 goals over 81 games. So, he's almost averaging a goal every 2 games. In terms of him, he scored 4 goals in 6 against Watford. So sort of an opposition that he enjoys playing against. But for me, it's more what he does in terms of the whole group. He kind of makes everyone around him look and feel so much better because of just the work he does and the crucial elements he plays in terms of the system and the way they're trying to play. So just in terms of him, I mean, did that game underline just how big a miss, I suppose, he's been over that sort of 3-month period he was out, because straight away back in the team, and it's not just the goals, it's everything else he brings to the party.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's easy to forget that influence when you're in that sort of cycle. It feels like, and this is only natural, but for the first couple of games after somebody gets a long-term injury, then you're going, you could tell that they missed Josh Sargent, but things move on quickly in football, and quite quickly you start to analyse what's in front of you rather than worrying about what Norwich are missing. But you just look at so many of those performances where so constantly the criticism was that they didn't have enough in the final third. There wasn't really anyone stretching the defence or any possibility to play the ball in behind. And how many of those games would have looked completely different if Josh Sargent had been there, with the presence that he provides up front, with the movement, the running beyond. It feels like there would have been much more for everyone else in the team, even disregarding the goals that he probably would have scored or the chances that he would have created himself. You look at somebody like Sargent, who basically went off the boil quite quickly after Sargent got an injury, and they were almost partners in crime at one time in the season. So I think you're right to highlight the fact that he gets the best out of everyone else, and that's for so many reasons. Probably part of it is not even tactical or footballing. It's probably the confidence that those players feel, knowing that they've got him up there, and that if you're a midfielder and you try a ball in behind, there's quite a good chance that Sargent's going to wrestle the defender out of the way and get there first. But also in terms of the pressing, the movement, as I mentioned, the fact that they can actually fire it into him when there aren't many people around him, and he's much better at holding it up and keeping it there than the other strikers that Norwich have had available. He gives the team so much besides just his goals and what he does on the ball. So yeah, I think for a number of reasons, Torrett will be delighted to have him back, and especially with this run of games where Norwich will probably have a decent amount of the ball, they should be able to create some good chances. Having a real true number 9 in there who'll sniff out those chances, who'll get into the box and put them away, I think could be really, really key. So yeah, looking forward to seeing what he can produce over the next few weeks, and I'm sure he's feeling confident after that brace at the weekend.
I suppose one of the talking points maybe going into this game is that left-back slot, which, I think there's been a lot of talking around that throughout the season. You've had Callum Dorr playing in there, you've had Ben Kraseni in there, but you've also got the new option in Lucien Mahovo. Of course, this time last year was playing for Boston United in the National League North. I think his last senior appearance before Saturday from the start was actually against Scarborough Athletic in last April. That's pretty big jump to then be playing Swansea City in the Championship in front of a 25,000 capacity crowd at Carrow Road. So in terms of that position for this weekend, how do you see Torrett approaching it? Do you think Mahovo warrants starting the game again? Do you think, obviously got to be a little bit careful not to kind of, I suppose, burn him out? Still a young player making his first strides in senior football. So how do you approach that if you're Johannes?
I think he will probably stay in the team. It was a solid enough display against Swansea. I think it was probably one where, to be honest, we were all guilty of judging him a little bit more favourably because of the situation he was in, his first start, I think, in league football. And that's absolutely fair because, it was quite a challenging circumstance for the reasons that you mentioned. But I think even taking that away, it was a decent 7 out of 10, no huge mistakes. You could rely on him on the ball. He tracked back properly defensively, physically, and this is something I keep talking about as one of his strengths. He doesn't look out of place whatsoever. And given the fact that Ben Kraseni, I think had struggled, and I think he probably would admit that himself against Leeds and Sheffield United, it does feel like Mahovo's got the initiative at the moment. And to be fair, Kraseni came on and I thought actually did really well in that cameo as a substitute late on, and that probably tells you the value of competition in that position as well. But I think it would feel quite harsh on Mahovo, given that the idea is you give young players an opportunity and then it's up to them to take them. I think it's fair to say that he took it. So to drop him for this one, unless there were specific tactical reasons, which of course we can't know and there may well be, but unless there are really specific tactical reasons, it seems fairly likely to me that Mahovo gets his second start in this one, and I think everyone will be pretty pleased with that. As you mentioned, especially with young players, sometimes you have to consider that workload. Torrett actually said in reference to Ante Sienats that the ideal sort of situation for him is 2 starts and then 1 on the bench. So I suppose that would fit with this, but also it's worth considering that Norwich have had a whole week to recover from Swansea and prepare for this one. So I think in terms of the physical load and the game time, it shouldn't be too much of a problem. And in terms of the form that he's shown, I don't think you can really complain. So yeah, if I had to say now, I'd feel fairly confident that Norwich fans are going to get another opportunity to watch Lucien Mahovo. And that feels like it can only be a positive thing based on how he played against Swansea.
Indeed, yeah, I think I'd agree with you. I'd be shocked if Mahovo's not in that starting 11 when it drops at 11:30 a.m. on Saturday morning. To answer your question, to Canaries, Simon's will be back for the home clash against Preston midweek, so he's missing Watford, missing Derby. Going to be back for that home game against Preston. So that'll be a huge boost. And in terms of that sort of wide player position, I'm just intrigued to get your take on Lewis Dobbin so far. Played 5 games now, 4 from the start. Obviously added that goal last weekend against Swansea, great celebration. You could sort of see the release and the passion, I suppose, within that. And that was only his second ever goal in terms of sort of like he scored for Everton a couple of years back. I think he scored a few for Derby in League One, but certainly at Championship level, that was obviously his first. So in terms of him, what have you sort of made of him in his start? Because I think in maybe those games against Leeds, Sheffield United, you could see the directness, you could see the pace. He clearly is someone that's going to run at the sort of fullbacks and try and get the ball back across, which particularly given Sargent's back feels like a good outlet. But with Sainz coming back in fairly short order, Jurasek back in the building, we obviously got Ono Hernandez as another wide option. Plenty going on in terms of those winger positions. How crucial is it now he continues to add these goals and assists, because he's going to have more competition moving forwards?
Yeah, he's a really interesting player, and I think it changes the perception a little bit that he managed to get that goal against Swansea, because he's someone who you watch and he can be so frustrating, because probably the ratio of the number of times he gets into the box, the number of times he goes one-on-one with a defender in the final third, the number of times he leads a counter-attack, the ratio of that to how many chances he's creating, how many goals he's scoring, doesn't feel like it's really high enough. So then you have games like Leeds and Sheffield United where it's just frustrating, because you can see the athletic ability that he's got. You can see some of the technical quality that he's got, but it just comes down to decision making. And probably in that Swansea game, it felt pretty much exactly the same way. At half time, it just felt like this could be a player who threatens and provides danger and gets fans off their seat, but never really produces. You look at, I think his stats at West Brom, I don't think he got a goal contribution in all of those games, which suggests that that's the sort of player he is. But now that he's managed to get that goal, first of all, it will give him the confidence. And I think also it will give the fans a little bit of patience as well, because of course they have no reason to believe in Lewis Dobbin. They haven't watched probably as many hours as Ben Napper has of his football at West Brom and Everton. Before that, they haven't seen the signs of somebody who can score goals or create chances until Saturday, when they did see that fantastic finish from Dobbin. So I think that will increase the belief for him sort of internally and externally. And hopefully he can then take that into the Watford game, because, as you said, it's about for him now continuing to produce those moments with Borja Sainz back, Mate Jurasek, as you mentioned, and the fact that they're permanent Norwich players. And I know Torop likes to talk about loan players like they're sort of permanent additions, but ultimately when the focus is on the long term, there's a lot of reason for Torop to favour Sainz and Jurasek and not much for him to favour Dobbin. So you feel like the threshold for him is almost a little bit higher, and he almost has to prove himself a little bit more. But I'm intrigued to see what his performance looks like after that goal at Swansea, and hopefully he can continue to produce that end product rather than just looking like somebody who maybe would threaten without producing, as he did probably in his first sort of 2.5 games for Norwich.
Yeah, it certainly feels like Sainz will benefit from having a little bit of competition in that sort of left wide position. His form in terms of goals and outputs sort of certainly dropped prior to that suspension that's kept him out for the last 4 games and another 2 games on the horizon. I think that just added competition is always healthy, and particularly a young player like Dobbin, who's still making his first sort of strides in his Norwich City career. That feels like it could be a good situation moving forwards. We'll talk a little bit, I suppose, about Watford, because I think there's probably more to talk about the opposition given their current circumstances at the moment, maybe relative to other times when we do these shows and speak about opposition. I mean, there's a lot going on there. I mean, I'd actually encourage anyone watching this after this is finished to actually go watch Terrace Talk this week, because it kind of unpacked everything that's happening at the moment at Watford. Obviously, Tom Cleverley came under fire a little bit in terms of his position. About a week or so back now, there was then all the kind of clubs coming out and having to tweet through their account and say, look, Tom Cleverley, it's pure speculation. He's going to be in the dugout for the game against Coventry. And I think there was another subsequent statement from the manager saying they fully back him, but they've not really invested anything in the January transfer window to sort of show a clear signal of intent that they're going to move forward with him. And I know there's a former Villarreal boss being linked there as well. So there's typical Watford fashion, I suppose, a lot going on. So in terms of that situation, Sam, more before we get on to kind of their season so far, what do you make of that? Because it's not unsurprising with Watford, but this feels a little bit different because Tom Cleverley, former player, well loved by the fans, seemingly doing a pretty good job relative to the resource he's got. So yeah, it's just a bit of a strange, I suppose, situation to be in again.
Yeah, it's quite a typical Watford situation, really, isn't it? And you mentioned Terrace Talk. I would recommend it as well, because it probably underlines the level of chaos that there is at that club. The fact that every time there is an episode around Watford and those guys, it does feel like there's quite a lot going on, and it can be quite chaotic. And I think that probably underlines where they are. After obviously all of those rumours, and as you mentioned, the club did come out and sort of back Cleverley and say that it was speculation, but there was quite a strong feeling that if it didn't go his way against Coventry, that he would probably not be in a job anymore. But obviously they lost that game, and here he still is. So it does feel like there's a lot of pressure on him going into this one, but it's not the same as when we would normally say that, because most of the time when we say that, the fans are involved in that, and the fans are going to be applying that pressure. And you feel that at other clubs, you go away to them where maybe the manager isn't especially well liked, and it can be a little bit of a pressure cooker for those players, and you feel like there's an opportunity for Norwich there, really. But from what I gather, it sounds like the Watford fans are still relatively on board with Tom Cleverley, as you mentioned. Feels like he's slightly outdoing maybe the resources that he's been left with, and a former player, somebody who's been around Watford for a really long time as well. So it is quite a strange position, because you feel like, if anything, the fans are going to be against the owners and against sort of the decision makers at the club. Whether that has an impact on the atmosphere on Saturday, we'll have to wait and see. But equally, it's probably at the point now where some of those fans, some of those players have just got used to what life's like at Watford, and it almost won't impact them. So, especially going to Vicarage Road, it will be really interesting to see what impact, if any, that has. But I'm sure when we ask Johannes about it tomorrow, that it will just be a case of trying to focus on themselves and not worrying about that too much. So I'm sure that's what Norwich will try to do. But in terms of the impact that it has on Watford, I'm really intrigued to see what it does, because I think it could swing either way, really. But you spoke to those guys on Terrace Talk. If you had to guess in terms of what that atmosphere is like and maybe how it pans out, what would you say that impact is likely to be?
Yeah, I think in terms of from the start, it'll be fully behind the team, fully behind Tom Cleverley, because their anger's not with those individuals at all. I mean, Tom Cleverley, I think even if he lost that game, we'd have full backing from the Watford faithful, which, bear in mind, that their form of late has been difficult. I think there's just one win in their last 8 in all competitions, 6 defeats in that run as well. And they had started the season in terms of their home form so strong, and they've now suffered 3 successive defeats there in the Championship. So that kind of tells you maybe the shift in terms of form. I think there's mitigation. I know injuries have been a bit of an issue for them. Certainly the goalkeeper Backman's been out for a bit, and I know they've got a bit of a midfield crisis, a little bit similarly to Norwich. So we're at that stage of the season where you can kind of expect that a little bit. But from what I can gather, there's maybe going to be sort of a protest a little bit against the ownership at some point later on in the second half. So I think if they're losing that game, and maybe that sort of added toxicity, I suppose, and frustration, they're going to point towards the board, which, is obviously not a healthy situation to be in. And it's quite different from the kind of bits I can take from what the Watford fans are saying. It's very different to previous times, because, you can understand it when they sack managers, and maybe it's understandable because the form's not been great, or they're not really on board and doesn't fit the club. Tom Cleverley, legend, they love him down there. I think he's one of their own, and played most of his games for Watford across his career, which, bear in mind, he played for some big clubs in Man United and so on. So, it's going to be an intriguing one. But, as I mentioned there, their form's been difficult. They've obviously had a similar season a little bit to Norwich, just 2 points above them in the Championship. I don't get the impression that they feel that squad and that group's capable of pushing for the playoffs, which is interesting given the start of this show. We were debating whether Norwich could do that. But what have you made of their season on the pitch, Sam, and them as a team and them as a unit? What are you expecting, I suppose, from them on Saturday?
Yeah, it's a really strange one, because Connor actually said to me the other day, and this resonated. It feels like Watford lose every week, but somehow they're still 9th in the table. They've had a really, really poor run of form, but they've never really pushed into sort of the top 6 or the playoff race certainly for a good while. So it does feel like quite a strange situation. I think when I was talking about the league table earlier, and maybe the opportunity that Norwich have to go and try to put themselves back in that playoff race, I think Watford probably underline that fact that you don't really need that many points or that much good form to be in and around it. But, they've got there somehow. And I think they do have quality in their team, certainly in sort of forward areas. Chakvetadze, I think, is somebody who's caught the eye for most Championship fans this season. They've got a good few players in there who you'd say were either kind of dangerous and will test the Norwich defence in a more direct physical way, or they're sort of solid in terms of Porteous and Pollock at the back and some of those slightly more experienced, more typical Championship players who they've got. So I think as a team, it's actually quite a decent one. But tactically, Norwich sort of took them apart really at Carrow Road. I think it actually played into their hands in so many ways. Watford with that sort of back three, it's sort of gone between a 3-4-3 and a 3-4-1-2 at times this season. But in any case, they don't have many bodies in that midfield. So when Norwich want to dominate possession, they've got that midfield three. They want to have the ball in the middle of the pitch. It's quite easy for them to control things. So if I were Tom Cleverley, I'd be looking at maybe changing things slightly tactically just against a team like Norwich who want to have so much possession and so much control of the middle of the pitch. But they do have individual quality. So if Norwich aren't quite at it, if they can't find a way to create those chances, which to be honest, I feel is unlikely given the fact they've got Sargent back now and a bit of that confidence. But if they do have an off day, then you feel like Watford have the quality to then go and maybe score the 1 or 2 goals that it would take to snatch a victory. And it sounds strange when Norwich are below Watford in the table at the moment, but I just think the way that the reverse game panned out, there are a lot of things about this Norwich team that can exploit Watford. But we obviously know, the away record. We know, Vicarage Road hasn't necessarily been an especially easy place for Norwich to go over the last few years. And Watford do have that quality, as I said. So, yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to how Norwich are going to play, to be honest. I think if they're at it, then they have a good chance of winning the game. But as I said, if they don't move the ball quite quickly enough, if they don't create those chances, then there is the individual quality in that team to probably take them apart and maybe even score a couple of goals.
Yeah, you're right. Just one win in their last 6 trips to Vicarage Road for Norwich. That was, of course, that pretty memorable night in the Premier League, which they managed to claw themselves out of the drop zone. We won't talk about how the rest of it unfolded. In terms of a few questions coming in, Peter asking, can Mate Jurasek be in the squad for Saturday's game against Watford? Dons is correct. Jurasek back for the Preston. They should be hopefully for Derby, but certainly the Preston game. Yeah, you'd imagine by that point it will all definitely be sorted. The Canary. 5 games in February, 15 points to play for. If City can gain 10 to 12 points, it could set things up for a very interesting run. I think particularly given, in your piece, you wrote about kind of the teams that they're playing. They're all in that pack from sort of, anywhere in the bottom half mainly, but there's quite a clutch of them that are just above Norwich, where if you can claw the points back and gradually start to pull away from a few of those teams, then certainly, as Stephen points out, a win on Saturday in 5th place, maybe 6th place is on. So it's intriguing how it's all going to play out. But you mentioned it there in terms of the away form and the away record. Only 3 wins on the road so far this season. One of those, of course, back in August at Coventry, 1 in September against Derby. So sort of since then, it's only been that win at Luton on New Year's Day, which, of course, we're heading to that neck of the woods again this Saturday. So maybe Norwich can try and replicate something similar. But in terms of that, how do Norwich address that, Sam? Because they do look very different at home as they do on their travels. So what do you put that down to? And I suppose they need to arrest that and try and sort that out between now and the end of the season if they are going to be realistically in the conversation for the top 6.
Yeah, honestly, it's quite a hard one to diagnose because you ask Torup about it and he says that the plan is the same, wherever they go. He wants to control the ball. He wants to sort of have that possession and try to dominate the game and create chances in that way. But you wonder if there is a psychological element to it. Obviously, all of those players will have been part of the away struggles this season, excepting obviously Lewis Dobbin and Mate Jurasek. Most of them will have been part of last season when Norwich also struggled away from home as well. So you wonder if there is a bit of a psychological barrier. But also just the fact that Carrow Road has been, I think, so excellent over the last couple of years, really. It feels like that atmosphere has really been back there and everything that we would have used to define Carrow Road, when things were going particularly well for Norwich, have been back there again. So maybe just losing those home comfort perhaps losing the atmosphere that there is at Carrow Road sort of takes away an element of what can be so good about their performance. But yeah, mainly I wonder if it's sort of psychological, because they know about that that away record, and it isn't quite as simple as you want to go and play the same way, go and play the same way. You know, the atmosphere is entirely different, the surroundings are completely different, and of course the opposition is different, because there's this sort of stereotype in football that when you're at home, you're expected to attack. When you're away, you sort of sit in. And I think what a lot of teams haven't realised when they go to Carrow Road is that sitting in against Norwich and allowing them to have the ball probably isn't what you should do. Whereas when those teams are at home, they do try to take the game to Norwich a little bit more. And that's where they maybe have struggled a little bit at times this season and last season. So I think some of it comes down to the opposition, but ultimately it's about building confidence and showing to themselves more than anything that they can do it, that they can produce the similar performances away from home. And although it is hard to diagnose, it does feel like the solution, whatever the root cause is just to get a couple of wins under the belt and just to increase that belief, stop it being a thing, stop those worries being there. And I think with this run of games, you can either see it as a shame that there are all those teams in and around them, but they've got to play them away, or you can see it as an opportunity, because you're unlikely to correct your form on the road against Sheffield United and Leeds. Whereas you look at some of the teams they've got to play, and it feels like they're winnable opportunities to get that away form back on track. So, yeah, I think it will be interesting to see what part that plays in this run of games. But if they do want to be pushing for that top six, then they can't just rely on wins at Carrow Road for the rest of the season, no matter how poor some of the teams in and around them are and how poor this division is. So, yeah, it's an important part of these next few games. And of course, it starts on Saturday. So, yeah, that will be an interesting part of the game as well.
Yeah, just turning the attention a little bit away from footballing matters on the pitch to off the pitch. There's a question from Alex here, which I was kind of obviously going to ask you around the transfer window and the maybe lack of activity we're experiencing at the moment. His question is, any more outgoing transfers / loans to be expected, especially on the youth front? Also, did the trialist from the under-21s game do enough to get that contract? So that was Dylan Jones from Plymouth Parkway, scored a couple of goals against Palace there the other day, which I think they had quite a strong team at Palace. I had a look and they had Rob Holden in there, and I can't remember, there was somebody else of a senior nature. So, yeah, that was a good run out, I suppose, for him. In terms of that, Sam, where are we at in terms of the state of play, I suppose, moving into Monday's deadline? It doesn't feel like on a senior level Norwich are going to do much in terms of incomings. And obviously we saw the lad from Dundee arrive this week, Alan Domeraki, a midfielder, not played any senior games for Dundee United, but clearly a talented player that Norwich were aware of to bring in. We had the links to Philo Asgard from Wigan, who's ended up subsequently moving to Luton. One that obviously I think we knew that Norwich were aware of in terms of a player, but probably given they didn't push the button on him, maybe not one of these top one or two targets in terms of individuals they wanted to bring in, because it probably, if you take Johannes at his word and sort of the bits we hear, then if Norwich had an opportunity to sign one of their top targets, they probably would have moved for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's basically where it is right now. I don't feel their squad needs anything in the short term. They think they're probably covered until the end of the season. Of course, there will be positions where they feel they can get more quality, but we've heard Ben Napper say before that he doesn't feel that January is necessarily the best time to do loads of business. They've done 3 signings this January, if you include Anis Ben Slimane, which I think was probably around about the sort of number I expected them to do. So yeah, they're in the situation again where if there's a player they want for 4 or 5 years and they can get him in now to bed him in over the rest of the season and then probably kick on next season, then they'll absolutely do that. But we're looking at this on the 30th of January and it doesn't sound like anything is particularly close. So aside from any sort of late business where one of those players becomes available, it does feel fairly unlikely that they're going to do anything on the senior front. You mentioned Domeraki, and there was that sort of trialist. I think he scored a couple of goals, didn't he, in that game, which probably suggests that he's made an impression. And if he can kick on, then of course he's someone who I'm sure Norwich would take a chance on at a low price. But in terms of those senior long-term targets, nothing we're hearing is imminent at the moment. And at this stage of the window, when the view is on the bigger picture, it does feel fairly unlikely. Of course, there is a scenario where a team comes in for one of their players and then they have to move to get a replacement in which case they will have long lists of players who are available and who they can go and get immediately. But again, it doesn't feel like the right time for a club to buy Borja Sainz. Josh Sargent's only just come back from injury and we haven't heard much about interest in him. Marcelino Nunez doesn't sound like much activity. There was that link with Everton that didn't end up really being much as far as Norwich were concerned. So right now I don't personally see anything happening on the senior front, but we know they're always looking at additions for the academy as well. So it'll be interesting to see if one happens with any of those development sides. But unfortunately, as much as I would love to tell you that we've heard about 4 or 5 signings that Norwich are going to be making in the next few days, right now it does sound like it's still pretty quiet.
Yeah, it does feel like the sort of academy and trying to get the Kenner Bows back out on loan probably going to be the more focus between now and that deadline on Monday night at 11 p.m. Dan asking a question, probably get a little bit of pushback for this, but do you have any idea on maybe who the club has in terms of a medium or long-term target to replace Gunn? Personally, don't see Gunn being that option. I mean, obviously, you take Johannes at his word from the press conference the other week when the question was posed around Gunn and whether there's going to be a contract renewal, and his response to me was pretty clear. I want a good goalkeeper in the building. Gunn, good goalkeeper, want one in the building. It wasn't kind of a definitive, we want Angus Gunn to be the long-term goalkeeper. So feels like there'll probably be a natural parting of the ways in the summer, Sam. But in terms of who Norwich see, maybe not necessarily names, but it feels like homegrown goalkeepers is probably going to be the way that they push forward with that in the summer.
Well, I think homegrown is going to have to be a theme of the summer, full stop. You look at how much they've struggled with that. It's getting to the point now where it's actually stopping them getting players out on loan because the only real options they have as backups to fill in slots in those squads are homegrown players. So I don't think it's in their long-term interest to keep battling short-term with this number of homegrown players who they have to have in matchday squads. There's also the sort of exemptions on the the Brexit rules and how many players Norwich can get through the door. In that sense, it feels like they're already pushing that, and of course that's why Matej Jurasek has had to wait until the 3rd of February to get his deal over the line and to come and officially be a Norwich City player and train with the team and things like that. So I think you're right in that the goalkeeper will probably be a homegrown one. You feel like they've got to maybe be looking at other Championship clubs and League One and League Two clubs, which I personally think, and I think we've said this a few times, is something that they maybe haven't utilised as much as they could have done in recent years. So yeah, it does feel to me like there will have to be that sort of flavour to the summer, and of course with Gunn going, another homegrown player, Grant Hanley now out of the building, Ashley Barnes, the man just behind you, Adam, now out of the club as well. It does feel like that's an area that they probably do need to address. And to be honest, they can't really afford to sign too many more players who are either foreign or don't qualify as homegrown because, they're really pushing those limits a lot. So, I think that's the sort of area they'll be looking for a goalkeeper. And as a general theme, I'd say that's something they have to look at in the summer as well. But yeah, agreed on your thoughts on Angus Gunn. I thought that was a carefully managed answer from Torrett when Connor asked him a couple of weeks ago, but it doesn't sound like things are really moving in too much of a positive direction as far as that contract.
No, indeed. Yeah, certainly a decent plethora of young goalkeepers who are homegrown sort of through the English pyramid at the moment. I sort of look down in League One and I think there's a few names that I would certainly like to see in the Norwich sticks next summer. So we'll see what happens in terms of that. There's a question here from Andy. Views on how we handle set pieces, strength or weakness. I'm assuming from a defensive standpoint there. And I suppose, how do you view the reaction, I suppose, of Norwich with dealing from set pieces in recent times? I mean, I know we've had this debate a lot throughout the season. There was certainly a period where it felt like it was a topical point of conversation in every preview show, every podcast, every other piece of content we do. So in terms of that and their, I suppose, evolution to this point, where do you stand on Norwich and dealing with set pieces?
I think they've actually got better defensively. As you said, at one point, it was a real key talking point, and that was because it felt like they were conceding goals from that avenue in almost every single game. But that talk has sort of quietened down recently, and I think that's because they've actually got better. They haven't conceded as many goals from set pieces. They haven't even conceded as many chances, really. So I think there has been improvement in a defensive sense. I'd still like to see a little bit more ingenuity in an offensive sense and try different things. That was something we saw from them last season, and I think the theme across football at the moment is that, you know, most professional football teams are able to see a cross coming into the box and get ahead to it and clear it. But if you can try something a little bit different, if you can create a situation that the defensive team aren't expecting to deal with, then that can really give you an advantage. So I'd like to see them try something a little bit different from attacking set pieces. They've done it a few times, but not really enough for me. But in terms of defensive set pieces, you know, you have to give them credit, because I think they have been you know, improving, and it does feel like it's going in the right direction. And unfortunately, this is the way that football works. But when we stop talking about something, that's usually because it's got better, and I think that is a good sign. And, you know, credit to Nick Stanley, who got a lot of criticism earlier on in the season for the set pieces, but I think he's contributed to them improving a little bit from those. But, you know, as I said, probably attack wise, they could be scoring a few more goals and trying out a few more things. But it does feel like the sort of thing that divides opinion a little bit. So probably worth asking your thoughts on that, Adam, as well. What have you made of the set pieces? Do you feel like they're going in the right direction or no?
Yeah, it certainly feels like there's been a few times in recent weeks where they've threatened a little bit more from set pieces. I mean, Duffy had one where I think if he gets a little bit more of a stronger connection and doesn't put it straight at the goalkeeper, then he's got an opportunity there early on against Swansea. Am I right in saying McLean hit the crossbar against someone from a set piece?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
I can't remember which game it was, but there was certainly one where he sort of managed to get himself to the near post and flick it on. So it's clearly something I think they're working on, and I saw Marcondes rubbing the back of his shirt a few times the other day. So whether that's still kind of an element of them trying to communicate with each other without obviously physically speaking to one another and giving the opponents any sort of sniff of what they're trying to do. But yeah, I think that's clearly a tool that Norwich can utilise. We saw it last season. You know, there was plenty of games where when they're fine margins and it's, you know, one goal in it, it can often be won or lost with a set piece. So yeah, the fact they obviously recruited somebody again to deal with that, I want to see them utilising that. Dan Mayhew saying, I'm surprised they don't go back to targeting the near post. That was effective last season. Yeah, they certainly profited a lot last season from that situation. When you've got the likes of Shane Duffy, Jose Cordoba, Callum Doyle, you know, decent sort of height, I suppose, now, maybe comparatively to years gone by, where it didn't feel like Norwich maybe had that physical presence to target set pieces quite the same. I think they've probably got that in the locker a little bit. A few other late questions coming through. Dubai Canary with the question, what would the issue be with keeping Gunn? Is it wages or something else? I mean, wages obviously are probably an element, Sam, because, you know, let's be real, he's probably one of the high earners at the football club. But I suppose there's also the debate about whether Torrup and the coaching staff see him as the goalkeeper they want for the long term with this group.
Yeah, obviously it all comes down to sort of value for money to an extent. And I think if Gunn was on £1,000 a week, then there would be no question as to whether he was worth keeping in the building. But equally, I think if Torrup was completely convinced by all of the parts of his game, then there would be more of a push to keep him at the club. I think it hasn't been his best season, and that's probably a bit of a shame for him and part of the problem, because last season under David Wagner, his focus was very short term and probably wasn't thinking about squad building as much as Torrup and Ben Napper are at the moment. He had arguably the best season of his career. He was absolutely fantastic, but there have been a few errors this season. I think there have been some very good performances, but maybe not on the same sort of consistent level as there was last season. And also with the style of play, I think there's even more onus on the goalkeeper to be able to play out and play those sort of mid-range passes into midfield. I think he's good at short range, putting his foot on the ball, having the sort of mentality not to get too worried about that and just playing the ball out to the centre-backs. In terms of long range, he's okay at putting it on the strikers' heads, but you probably want those goalkeepers who are able to take risks and play the ball into midfield and spot passes into the fullbacks in advanced positions and things like that. And that probably is an area that Gunn needs to work on. And you wonder if maybe Torrup is looking at a couple of goalkeepers who embody that a little bit more. And if you're not perfect in the current financial situation and the fact that Norwich are in the Championship without parachute payments, then you probably can't receive the wages that Gunn unfortunately is on at Norwich at the moment. So it is more than just money. It's money and football, but of course it's all about value for money and about that balance. So I think probably both things come into consideration at the moment. But yeah, if you're on those sorts of wages, you probably need to fit Torup's system just a little bit more as far as he's concerned. And yeah, it'll be interesting if he does leave, which feels likely, to see which sort of goalkeeper comes in, because that probably will also tell us a good amount about the reasons why Gunn has left, if he does.
Indeed, yeah. I'll be live for another sort of 5-10 minutes. So any late comments, questions, score predictions, get them down below, and we'll try and answer a few of those before the end of the show. Dan asking, saying, I personally like playing out from the back. How do we educate English football fans that this works? I'm fed up with the discourse on this. I mean, Johannes Torup, I thought was pretty good, actually, a couple of press conferences ago now, speaking about this. And I mean, for me, if you're a Norwich fan, if you're a general football fan, I'd probably divert you straight to that. I think it was pre-Leeds, wasn't it? The press conference where he spoke pretty openly for 5-10 minutes plus about the benefits and maybe the cons, I suppose, of it. But ultimately, the benefits, are probably more there in terms of what it can provide for Norwich as a sort of stable background for trying to build up from the backs, and the benefits of that. So, with that, Sam, can you ever really fully convert everybody to be fully on board with it? Because inevitably there will be some individuals and some football fans that aren't fully comfortable with it.
I don't think you can convert everyone, to be honest. There are definitely a section of supporters who you can convert and you can change into fans of certain systems, and we probably saw that under Daniel Farke when at the start it was quite a struggle seeing that playing out from the back at Canaries Road, and there definitely was a nervousness about it in that first season. But then when it starts producing success, of course, there's a large section of the fan base that will come with it when sort of results follow. But equally, you can't ever please anyone. I think part of it is about the experience we all have of football and how much of it we've seen as playing out from the back. Somebody of mine and yours generation, Adam, probably about half of the football that we've ever seen in terms of the wider context has been, playing out from the back has been normal. But there's probably other generations where it's only been 20% of their football supporting career has anybody even attempted playing out from the back. And I think that's kind of natural. It could be that in 20 years, you've got goalkeepers dribbling into midfield or overlapping the fullbacks, in which case I'm sure me and you will say, I don't know what all this rubbish is. I wish we could go back to, goalkeepers staying in their goals and playing out from the back. So I think there is a little bit of that generational thing where maybe we've all got different expectations and experiences of football. But equally, I think the largest section of the support will go with results. So I think you can split it up into a lot of little groups. Some of them will love playing out from the back regardless. Some will be reticent, but when you explain it, they'll come along with you. But I think probably the majority, it's about results. And if Norwich can produce results playing out from the back, then they'll love it. If they lose a load of games playing out from the back, then they'll hate it. So for me, the results are the most important thing in terms of keeping people with you. And that's not me saying there needs to be a short-term focus. I think we all understand the need to look to the long term for Norwich at the moment. But I'm just saying I don't think everyone will be convinced until Norwich do start making the most of that and start getting the results out of it. And that's just football. So I think Torup's explanations are valuable to a certain section of the fan base. And you mentioned that section in the press conference. I'm trying to think which game that would have been before, but I would recommend that anyone goes back and tries to find it, because it was a very informative, very interesting section. But ultimately, I think the football has to be what decides it, and the results will decide it. And ultimately, if Norwich go and win the league next season or the season after that, then 95% of fans will love playing out from the back, as was the case under Daniel Farke when they last did it.
Yeah, the fact Johannes had all the stats ready to go in terms of backing it up, and how I suppose the benefits of it outweigh the sort of negatives of playing that way is pretty good for anybody that's maybe got some fears or not fully comfortable with it. Then he can explain the reason why they play like that. Sam, I suppose to round off the show, how do you see this game unfolding on Saturday? As we referenced, I suppose, a little while ago, not being the overly most happy hunting ground for Norwich in the Championship. The last time we actually won at Vicarage Road in the Championship would have been under Alex Neil in that playoff season. I remember being at that game. They won 3-0. It was pretty good day to be at Vicarage Road, but they've had some pretty tight encounters, a few sort of 3-2 defeats. There tends to be a lot of goals between these two. So how do you see it, Andy, going for a 2-0 Norwich win? So are you feeling the same way, confident that Norwich can go to Vicarage Road and get a result?
Yeah, I am, to be honest. I feel like there are a few things going in Norwich's favour. That win against Swansea was a big thing. Sargent getting back on the score sheet was a big thing, and there will be that confidence in the team now against a team who they completely outplayed at Canaries Road, who tactically didn't really feel like a match for them. They're obviously in their own situation as well, as we talked about earlier, the problems that they've got. It's just, for me, about whether Norwich can get over that away from home hump, and if they can deal with that a little bit better than they have at other times this season. If they can, then I think you look at the two teams and the situations they're in, and Norwich probably are favourites, but I think you add in the away element and it's just about 50-50. But I'll go just to the positive side of the fence, and I'll say 2-1 Norwich, because I think if they can put a performance together, then they've got a decent opportunity. What about you, Adam? Are you feeling positive as well?
Yeah, I went pretty optimistic actually when I'd done the opposition podcast with the Watford lads I use Monday night. I think I went for a 3-2 Norwich win, because I just sort of naturally put Watford and Norwich with lots of goals between them, but they were pretty adamant that Watford aren't really scoring goals at the moment, and maybe that's been a bit of a difficulty. I mean, their top goal scorer is Bio. I think he's got 10 goals, but they sort of caveated that by the fact he scored 4 of those goals against Sheffield Wednesday away, so he's only really scored 6 over the course of the season. I think a couple of those came in one game. So they were sort of speaking more generally about their sort of issues going forwards and scoring goals. But I'm going to stick with it. Norwich 3, Watford 2. That'll be a big 3 points, and probably then gives them that real springboard moving into those couple of home games back-to-back against Derby and Preston. Because I think, as someone mentioned earlier on in the show, it might have been the Canaries, this sort of February run of games feels like it's got a real opportunity if Norwich are going to try and push for the playoffs. And, you can debate between yourselves whether that's a good thing for the club in the long term, getting in the playoffs. And if they did somehow manage to make a route to the Premier League next season, whether that would really benefit them for the longer haul, which personally I'm of the view that another season in the Championship, not the worst thing. But there we go. People can debate that between themselves. But I suppose, it's going to be an intriguing one. But I always enjoy a trip to Vicarage Road, and early kick-off means we can get home a little bit earlier as well in the evening. So, don't mind that at all. I think with that, that's probably everything for the show. Thanks for joining us, of course. This lunchtime, plenty of good content. You're already on the YouTube channel or coming your way as well over the next day or two. We've obviously got Terrace Talk I mentioned at the start, which I think probably I'd actually really encourage a lot of people to go and watch. I don't usually blow my own trumpet, but in terms of that, I think it's a good one. They speak a lot about kind of the situation and everything that's going on at Watford at the moment. So that's well worth looking into. Ahead of this one, obviously, we've had a lot of coverage this week around the youth games. So a lot of stuff there in terms of that FA Youth Cup defeat, which of course is a little bit frustrating for the young lads. Nearly a quarter-final opportunity for those. We also had an interview with Emi Marcondes on there, which I think was really good in terms of him opening up about maybe his battles with grief and obviously the sort of mental impacts that had on him and his football career. So I feel like that's well worth going and checking out. And of course, we've got stuff coming your way tomorrow. The press conference is tomorrow lunchtime, so we'll be down at Colney covering all that. Sam will do tactics board for tomorrow morning as well. So maybe more of a look at the 11 that will play in that game against Watford. And of course, got the offer as well on the app at the moment. You can get a subscription, £18 for an annual subscription. So we think that's pretty good value for money. So well worth going and checking that out if you haven't already. Jeffman with a late comment. Hi, gents, listening on the train as we're finishing. Yeah, unfortunately, Jeffman. Let's hope for 3 points on Friday. I just he's corrected himself. I was going to say Friday. Unless I've got my dates wrong, then the game's definitely on Saturday. But Saturday game. Let's hope, as Jeffman says, for a Norwich City 3 points. We'll be at Vicarage Road for that kickoff, early kickoff, 12:30. So anybody that's maybe that's missed them, definitely check in for Team News Live at 11:30. So, we'll see you then. And let's hope for another positive weekend following the Norwich on the road.